welcome to the second annual Capital City Corral C4. We're very excited to have everybody here today. C4 is hosted by the Austin Reef Club. Many of you are members, and if you're not, we welcome you into our club. Our mission is to provide a community for aquarists focused on marine husbandry, conservation, and the promotion of captive coral propagation and breeding. And we welcome you to join us. I think a major part of reef keeping and animal husbandry in general is learning from other people. If you've never taken one piece of advice from anyone on reef keeping at all in your career, raise your hand right now. Good. Nobody raised their hand, which means you're all excellent reef keepers. You take advice well and learn from others. You're not stuck in your ways. And we are very excited to introduce the ARC Mentor Program this year, which is a face-to-face, and it can also be digital communication between a mentor and mentee to help cultivate the knowledge of reef keeping. And Bud's going to introduce that for us.
Well, yeah, the overall goal of this new mentoring program on the Reef Club is just going to be to provide like a guidance for newbies to the hobby. Everybody gets on and Googles how to run a saltwater tank, and it's add fish and salt, hang on back filter. So we just want to have like the end goal is to be like a well-documented build on like specific types of things to teach lessons of exactly what type of setup, sand and algae. I want clownfish, you need this, you need that. But we want to document it in case we start to lose mentors or members. We'll have it documented well on the build threads so that someone can come back and replicate that exact tank down the line. We will be, in effect, creating new hobby mentors and trying to reduce the amount of redundant questions that keep happening every so months. We get new people asking, what's a refractometer? So the overall goal is to make our hobbyists more successful and better educated while reducing the number of mistakes. Obviously mistakes is death in livestock. Keep that down.
Great, so when you guys came in today, I believe everyone received one orange raffle door prize. Those are for the buckets on the outside. There will be 3 drawings throughout the day. You have to be present to win, but by present we mean you have to be able to pick up your gift if you won one by the end of the day. And we'll have 3 announcements. So if you want one of the first raffle door prizes, make sure they're in before 11:15. And be sure to check out the Austin Reef Club merchandise next to the registration table. They'll be happy to help you if you want to buy a premium club membership, which allows you to sell things on the Reef Club, and then you also get different discounts at local fish stores if you're a premium member. And if you've been waiting here to earn additional door prize tickets, each purchase of $10 of Austin Reef Club swag entitles you to 1 door prize ticket. Purchases of at least $30 receive 4 door prize tickets. Money raised from these purchases is used to support our monthly meetings, frag swaps, and other charities that we donate to, such as Reef Reconstruction, and local high school scholarships, which we'll also be talking about later. Additionally, in the middle, you'll notice several bigger items that are marked raffle drawings. Tickets to win these prizes are exclusively available by making a donation to Tim's Memorial Scholarship Fund. And further details are available at the registration table. And now, without further ado, Bud's going to go ahead and introduce our first keynote speaker.
Well, while many of you may not immediately recognize the name Paul Rogers, mention the 1,700-gallon tank thread on ARC in the Triple S Fish Ranch 1,700-gallon, 164-inch by 48 by 46 SPS Peninsula build thread spawned the idea. Like a hobbyist like us, Paul started with a 75-gallon with softies in 1990. He upgraded to a 205 mixed reef in 1997, then added a 750-gallon in 2002. His love of the hobby continued to grow, as did his dreams of what would come next. The answer came when plans began to solidify in 2011, preceding actual construction that began in 2012. This tank is built and in place and should see the introduction to livestock later this year. I'm sure we're going to have time for questions at the end, and I definitely want to ask if there's going to be tank rentals available so we can come in and just dive directly, or should we rent tanks before we come? But I'm sure we'll come up.
Thanks, everyone. So let's see if I can get the slides going first. All right. So When Mike and Tim Fish reached out to me to possibly talk about the tank, one of the things they thought was most interesting about it is the way that I approached it as planning it for a 30-year build. So that's going to be the emphasis of this. I wasn't able to get a comprehensive system review in enough time for this presentation, meaning I don't have enough time to talk through all the details of it, so I've kind of specialized in the things which were interesting related to the scale of the intended time frame of the tank. So I'm going to go through background, system overview as it is so far, those special considerations. If we have some time, I'll dive into the system details around filtration and flow and such, and of course take questions. So, as was mentioned, started in 1990 with the 75. From the beginning, I loved refugiums. I probably spent about as much time in the refugium staring at the sort of algae and critters in there. Added the 205, which is my first entry into Stonies in 1997, and it had a little display refugium integrated with it as well. 2003 is when I went to a 750-gallon, started as a fowler, and then I added softies over the years. It had a little bit of a filter room behind it, you can see in the lower left there. And then put some fancy cabinetry on it towards the end. And then in 2011 is when we started thinking about our retirement in a few years, final house, and final tank to go with that house, and a lot of planning. So I had a vision from all of my obsessive hours of reading Reef Central and ARC, and I wanted a kind of wall-like effect. I wanted it to be see-through, relatively sparse aquascape, and schools of fish. And so the two of the more successful schooling fish you deal with are tangs and chromis and ampias. So that's the intent for it. And you'll also see how that relates in some of the long-term considerations a little bit later. With the tank, I knew that I wanted bigger and more room for large tanks. So with my 10-foot tank, I realized that even that wasn't enough for a Vlaminki when they get a little older and they're such strong swimmers and they kind of bounce off the ends. Also, my 10-foot was configured with a 2-foot corner overflow, so it was kind of narrow on the front, and the fish ended up treating like an 8-foot tank because they didn't like that narrow part in front of the overflow. I knew I wanted to automate it more, in part because I was already at my threshold for how much maintenance time I was willing and able to put into it, which worked out to about 20 minutes most days, 2 hours most weekends, and then about once a month, kind of a 5 or 6 hour day. But here I am, doubling, tripling the water volume, and hoping to maintain the same time schedule. So I need more automation, clearly. I learned a number of lessons from those previous tanks, and we'll touch on those as I go through some details here. SPS is priority 1. So one thing I should qualify on here is that mixed reef tank I really only ran Stonies successfully in it for about 5 of the 15 years it was up. And it may have been husbandry issues or things I couldn't test in the water, but ultimately when I started having issues with my Stonies was when the softies really started taking off. And I kind of suspected that there might be some chemical warfare. I also made the mistake of introducing some very propagation-happy softies, and it was really impossible to get them all out at the time. I got to the point of thinking that maybe I should have a lot fewer softies in here. And then another thing was just to make it as silent as possible. A couple of reasons. 750 had pretty decent hum of pumps, and the flow of the water wasn't so bad, but it still kind of intruded into the living space. And the new tank is intended to be in a room that's also a media room, as quiet as possible. So this takes us to 2014. So this is the tank of the thread. So it's about 13 feet 8 by 4 feet wide by 56 tall. The 56 tall fell out of the fact that I knew I wanted 4 feet of actual glass panel that I was looking through. And so then by the time you allow for framing, overflow, water height and stuff, that's where the 56 came in. The original intent for the tank was to be 16 feet by 6 feet. Architectural constraints shoved me down to 4 feet. And then for those of you who ever look at really long stretches of Starfire glass, it turns out that if you go to 13 feet 8 inches, there's 2 manufacturers to choose from. If you go over 13 foot 8, there's only one, and they like to charge more than twice per foot. Got a little bit much. So this is how we ended up here. Fish room, one shot of the filtration portion of the fish room, which sits below the display. Orienting you on the house, if you look at the red rectangle, the display room is the upper portion on the right of the red rectangle, so that's a 24 by 12 room for the tank walk around area. And then there's about a 40-foot long fish room and a quarantine area that sits below it. Part of it is took over a car garage bay and then added a 24-foot length So what were the special considerations as I started thinking about doing a system at this size? There were a bunch. There's some flat-out physical and structural issues that come into play when you're talking about this size. Noise, again, not just that I wanted it quiet, but I'm moving a lot more water. There's a lot more happening. Bigger pumps, bigger equipment, noise is even more of a concern. Humidity mitigation. So I've been reading Reef Central since it started, as far as I can recall, and I remember early post thread that's called Mr. 4000. The guy put a 4,000 gallon tank in the basement of his house and actually rotted out the subfloor above and ended up wrecking his house as a result of this tank. So I knew I wanted to get humidity mitigation right. Pest and disease control. So it's a tank this size. I can't be fussing with, oh, there's a rock that has some unwanted zoanthids in the lower left there, I'll just pick it out and scrub them off. It's going to be kind of awkward to get to things. Can't treat in the tank, so I really need to make sure that I don't introduce any pests. Robustness and redundancy, big scale, implications of failures are that much bigger. Stocking an aquascape. So some special factors came in when I started thinking about stocking an aquascape for a 30-year system. And then maintenance, which I'll go into at some point. All right, so starting off with the physical side. There's the tank construction aspect of physical. As I started thinking about it, for me, the standard options didn't work well for a tank that was intended to last this long. I'd lived with acrylic in the 750 for 9 years. I accumulated scratches over the years. It was starting to craze around the edges. Even though I doubled the thickness specified by the structural engineer, I was worried about UV degradation. I tried scratch kits that everyone said would work wonderfully, and I followed the threads where people did it. Sorry, I can't do it. And this is even on the outside, let alone the scratches that started to accumulate inside. My glass tank, the 205, was a Starfire tank, and 15 years old, when it was 15 years old, and the 750 was 8 years old, the Starfire still looked pretty much new, and the 750 looked like it had been through the water. So, had to get away from acrylic. Glass issue is when you do these silicone construction glass tanks, they tend to degrade over time. They're estimated to have a 12 or 15 year life depending on the stress you're putting on it. So, what do? The answer that I came up with was to do an FRP in glass construction tank. So the way this works is, just picture making a solid box, like a crate almost. And FRP construction, extremely strong. I don't know if it's any stronger than acrylic. Similarly, when it's welded, it's no longer a joint. It's like the materials are the same. In addition, you can put these mullions in the corners to further reinforce. So you've got this bulletproof box. Now, cut some panels out of it to do viewing. And then you need to leave a frame around the edge, slide a piece of glass in behind. Now what's happening is the water pressure is pushing the glass into the frame. Only thing your silicone has to do at that point is keep water from leaking around the edges. So this should be a much more robust over time approach. So just a close-up of a corner of the tank. So it's an 1.5 inch thick FRP frame in front of 1.5 inch thick 3-layered laminate Starfire glass. And then the top supports normally are done with FRP as well, but I didn't want the shadowing, and I also wanted to make sure that I could crawl around on top of the tank as necessary for servicing. So in the lower right, you can see a picture of the 2-inch thick acrylic cross braces. So it lets light through, but also lets me crawl around on top. Next up on the physical side, tanks like this weigh a lot. When this goes in the room with everything around it, cabinetry, livestock, water, it's about a 22,000 pound proposition. And it's going on the second floor of the house. Lots of structural steel to make that happen. Other part is the tank, even empty, when you're setting it up, it's 3,500 pounds dry. You can't do anything with manpower with a 3,500 pound object. It's not big enough. If I could get 40 people, you can't get 40 people actually applying force to it. So what does this lead to? Well, there's some pictures, a lot of steel. So these are 18 and 24 and 12-inch structural steel members gathered together. Pull it in. And what we're looking at here is underneath, and on the right, you see a crate, or the left, sorry. You see a crate. That crate is the sump, and that's the filter room that's below the display. You see all those extra cross beams of steel up there. That's for directly outlining the tank, providing a lot of extra structure around it. The stand. The stand got interesting, so I had to design it in two parts, because this relates to how do you go about moving and setting up a tank that weighs this much. And if you look closely, the top lid, you can see some lumber standoffs, and then it kind of hangs over the sides. That's what sits under the bottom of the tank, and it slots onto some pegs on the stand itself. So here's the tank getting uncrated. And the manufacturer very so nicely put it directly onto the flat bottom wood of the crate. So how are we supposed to lift this thing? Well, I didn't take pictures because I was too busy sweating it, but what they told us to do was instruct the forklift driver to drive up to the tank, put his tines against the bottom edge, and push. So it'll go between the wood and the tank. So he tried that from the lift position first, and the whole thing just slid. So we actually had to go to the end of the tank to have enough friction to be able to force him under, then put risers, then come back around and lift. Now, this gets back to the top of the stand. If you look here, forklift's about to place it on the stand. And so the metal frame that you saw before is under those 3 pieces of wood. Why 3 pieces of wood? Well, we had to design the top of the stand with slots for the forklift tines built in, so that the forklift can pull over, drop down, and the tines have a place to pull out without taking it right back off the top of the stand. Once it's on the stand, the wings that you saw around the edge and part were so, again, you can't just tilt the tank back and put your lift straps underneath. So the stand being in 2 parts, that gave me a place to slide the straps under. And because it's very hard to make out here, but you can kind of see that the top is actually 2 layers of 2-inch tubular steel. So there's the larger part, and then there's the inner frame. And then if you also look closely, now you can't move the projection here, but there's some pegs sticking up from the stand, so it slots perfectly. All right, so enough on the physical. Next, special consideration, noise control. So I wanted to have no audible noise in the living area. For noise mitigation, first off, try not to generate any more than you have to. So I used all DC pumps. And they're in a separate room, except for the closed loop which sits under the tank, but it's a DC pump. You have to put your hand onto here, it's pushing 4,500 gallons an hour. Overflow, it's going to flow 4,000 to 8,000 gallons an hour, depending on the time of day. So that could sound like a hot tub full bore if you're not careful. So for that, I have the majority of the flow handled by a full siphon, which is completely psionic, and then multiple large torsos to distribute the rest of the 1,500 gallons or so that don't go through the siphon. Wanted to put 4 to 6 inch thick walls around the base of the canopy for sound absorption. And the doors and the cabinetry have 2 layers, which you can see here in the bottom picture. So there's the pretty wood cabinetry that looks nice, and then behind that are 2-inch thick solid core doors below what they're sealed. And here you can see the stand up close and the way that it has a 6-inch gap all the way around. So next up, moisture mitigation. Again, the story of Mr. 4000 scared me. With the 750 in our other house, it shared the airspace with our house, which was a regular size 4-bedroom, 2-story, plenty of room. Air conditioner ran all the time, humidity never got noticeably high. By the time we moved out 9 years later, rust and salt had gotten everywhere in that house. The farthest back corner upstairs bedroom air conditioning register just covered with rust. The piano 50 feet away with the lid closed 90% of the time, rust on the strings. So for this, I really didn't want to repeat that, especially thinking about this running for 30 years now. Evaporation, I actually don't know. I'm anticipating 10 to 20 gallons per day. The reason I don't know is on my 750, I didn't have active dehumidification. I was running metal halide lights that drove more evaporation. So I've got to see how all those factors sort out. But everything's spec where it can support up to 30 gallons of air a day. And then flooding's another concern. So with the 205 and the 750 both, it might just be me, but over the years, I've always managed to spill anywhere from 5 to 50 gallons on flooring, and you need to worry about what happens after that. So among lessons learned there. Moisture mitigation on the humidity side. So the structural steel that you saw, clearly I don't want that corroding over a 30-year period, so that's all sprayed with a closed cell foam. There's actually four HVAC-related items in the fish room and aquarium alone. There's one HVAC just for the canopy, there's one HVAC for the filtration portion of the fish room, there's one HVAC for the QT portion. On top of that is a large dehumidifier. The reason I have to have that is by the time I run those HVACs enough to keep humidity down in the fish room, the room's going to be an icebox. So at times when it starts to get too cold, the dehumidifier kicks in. Making sure the walls are FRP plastic, so it's kind of the orange peel texture plastic stuff you see in commercial kitchens. And mold tough drywall behind that. Epoxy paint when things are exposed, marine epoxy. Minimizing exposed metals. And among those, one lesson I learned with the 750 is about mismatched metals and galvanic corrosion. So when you have salt air and you have metals of two different types, it turns out that that ends up creating a chemical reaction that leads to corrosion. And there can be aluminum with a steel screw going through it, it can be stainless steel and aluminum. So I try to match metals wherever possible when I have to have them. And of course covers for all the time. So this is a shot of the ceiling in the fish room. And if you look in the uppermost left corner is the HVAC for that room. Big box straight in front in the middle is the dehumidifier with ducting that shoots its output to opposite ends of the room. Big tray just past that with the silver massive looking thing is the HVAC ducting that goes up to the canopy system. And then there's another HVAC down at the end. Additionally, there's some venting that pulls outside air in when the humidity is low enough, so I'm not running these compressors without heat. All right, so flooding aspect of things. Had powder-coated steel stands with both my previous systems. They sat on the floor, nice and level, everything was great. I learned that over time, even powder-coated steel will rust if it sits in salt water. And the lesson I took from that is that every steel stand now sits on these plastic composite risers. So I don't end up with water trapped in the base. This was exacerbated in 750 because I had a plywood board that held my sump, so I couldn't even get in to mop up water. But just avoid that as an issue, assuming that floods will happen. There's a fiberglass shower pan completely under the full display tank. And the overflows, I want to make sure they don't overflow. So there was another thread on Reef Central about, I can't remember the name of the thread, but beautiful indoor-outdoor system. And he had a rat get in one of his overflow tubes, and it clogged and it flooded and ended up killing his tank. It's very sad, but in this case, I wanted to make sure I had 3 levels of redundancy. So the full siphon carries almost all the flow. If it were to clog completely, the dorsos by themselves can handle the entire flow at max output. And then at a level above the dorsos is another even larger full siphon that will form if necessary. That has a water sensor on the end of it as well, so that if that ever starts flowing water, I'll get a notification from my Apex and know that I need to look into what's going on. All right, next up on special considerations, redundancy and robustness. Talked about the drain system just a second ago. On the flow side, multiple power heads at the tank, a little more detail on that later, plus a closed loop. On the robustness of the flow, I tried to use mag drive pumps wherever possible. Seals go out over time. I wasn't able to follow that all the way through, as we'll get into later, but by and large, pumps are almost all mag drive, so I don't have to worry about them. Power, there's a 48 kilowatt generator which backs up most of the house and all of the aquarium related equipment. We'll kick on in a few minutes if I do lose power. And then on the oxygenation side, the skimmer pulls all of its air from the outside to make sure I have fresh air. This was a lesson I learned on the 750 where I had some pH issues after a few years as organics started to accumulate. And when I started pulling outside air in, that addressed almost all of the pH issues. Just do that from the beginning. And then I'm really worried about the tank being deeper than it is wide. And so for supplemental oxygenation, I have some air stones going into the display that will run at night. And any time the skimmer goes off. Next up, aquascape and stocking. So on the aquascape side, I did want an open look, but there's also the simple consideration that 30 years is a long time for stuff to grow. And so things are going to be sparsely placed and given plenty of room to grow as well. All of the structure, again, tank taller than it is wide, but also just over time, even carefully, tightly stacked rock as corals grow off of balances shift. So everything is underpinned with a PVC skeleton to make sure the rocks fall against the glass. On the stocking side, Another lesson learned from the 750 and the 205 is no troublemakers. All of those might work in the reef, sometimes work, okay. Fish, they all turn eventually, at least that's my experience. And so I'm just not gonna risk it. As pretty as those beautiful tangs and angels and butterflies are, they're staying out. The real knife in the back for me was 11 years in, my copper-band butterfly turned into a bastard. Thought that was the one butterfly that was safe, but he wasn't. And then starting small. So I got some show-size fish in the 750. I mentioned learning that they don't really fit even in that size tank. I've had tons of time for a big grow. I can't help myself. Well, I won't get a Flamingi, I have to get an Azo, and I have to get a few other guys that are eventually going to get really too big for the tank, but at least if they're not also strong swimmers, I won't feel quite so good. And the no more than 10% softies and 10% LPS, again, could be misattributed as to the issues I had with SPS keeping in my previous tank, but I'm just going to eliminate that as a risk factor. Special considerations on pest and disease prevention. So I mentioned before, can't really get things out once they're in. So I'm starting with dead rock aquascape. This was maybe the hardest part of this build so far. I had a lot of really beautiful live rock in 750, and I put it through the cooking process. So that, in my case, was take it all out, bleach it for about 6 hours, rinse that, put it in an acid bath for a couple of days, rinse that, and soak it in lanthanum chloride. Since this has been running for 15 years, I have phosphate buildup in there. That went on for about 4 months while construction was happening. And a continuous cycle of put the lanthanum chloride in, goes to 0, over the course of the week it rises up. But I had it down low, and I had there were no volunteer algae other than very light surface coating, like green, that were happening by the end, so I think I got the phosphates relatively under control. 2-month quarantine for everything live. And this is not just the fish and corals, it's also cleanup crew and even live sand. So I had some live sand with Bryopsis emerged from. I decided to add live sand for biodiversity about 7 years in on that 205, and Bryopsis appeared a few weeks later. So again, may not be proper attribution, but even my live sand is going to go under observation in full lit quarantine. And then to support this, as I think about trying to get this stocked to a reasonable level over time, I'm setting a 3-year target for being able to stock it, and to achieve that, I came up with the 5 quarantines. So 4 75s, and here you're looking at the rack that'll hold them. Story on the 90 in the corner is sad and long. I won't go into it, but those are the 2 surviving remnants from. The intent originally was to migrate the 750 and the 205. There was a bit of a disaster that happened, so those are the only guys remaining. Once the whole thing goes, that'll just be 4 QT tanks. And then on the right, you're looking at the 4 foot by 3 foot island coral QT. So, special considerations on maintenance. 750 had a little bit of a fish room, but it had most of the equipment under the tank. Hated that over time. Especially as you get bigger, there's further across that you're trying to reach. It's such a hassle, and if it's hard to do, I don't do it as often as I should. It may say more about me than proper aquarium setup, but I'm going to work with that limitation and try to make everything as open as possible for access. And that results as try not to put anything under or behind other stuff. Then set of equipment, so I'm a gadget guy. Over the years, I went through everything on my systems. I have nothing bad to say about these as good, functioning, useful for what they do. To me, the cost-reward trade-off of maintenance versus benefit, these were on my ban list. Calcium reactor, pumps to clean, chambers to clean. CO2 replacement was actually an issue at this scale. The largest CO2 canister I could reasonably transport for refilling is only going to last about 1 month. So every single month, I'm going to go through a 2.5-hour process of disconnecting, driving down, get it refilled, bring it back, reconnect it. That was out. Sulfur denitrators, algae turf scrubbers, refugiums. Much as I loved them in their time, they do. I went to a simple refugium on 750. It was nothing but a big ball of Chitomorpha, a deep sand bed. And it grows fast, and you're harvesting Chitomorpha, and I can't stand to kill things, so I'm always trying to find homes for Chitomorpha on a non-stop basis, and I just had to go. Similarly, bioballs, zeolites, short life mechanical filters. The RODI unit on this is a 1,000 gallon per day commercial unit. And it's not because I need anything approaching 1,000 gallons a day even for this system, but it's because that was the smallest system that had filters with a minimum 12-month life for the mechanical media and 3-year life on the RO. So a lot of selections were made based on how much kind of minimize maintenance. There's stuff you can't avoid doing though. And so I wanted to automate as much of that, and I wanted to make things that I couldn't automate as easy as possible. So the primary areas I tackled there were the water changes, mixing of salt. The reason that's a pain is with 750, I had a 7-foot tall, 225 gallon reservoir with a 6-inch opening up top. And you're hauling a 60-pound bucket of salt up there, trying to pour it in this narrow opening. I'll be making 200-gallon salt mixes about every 8 days with the new tank, so I just wanted to come up with a way to not have to hassle with that. Vacuuming, I'm going to keep a cosmetic sand bed in the display tank. And for vacuuming, I didn't do that. I ended up pulling the sand bed about 6 years in on the 750 because I wasn't keeping up with maintenance, because I had to drag a brood over and start a siphon and then find something to do with the water. So did something to address that, and then a power head on a stick to make sure it's easy as possible to keep the aquascape going. Filter socks, I know some people like to run them, some don't. I do like to run them. It's got to be plain simple, that easy to pop them out and slide. And the biological filtration will talk a little bit more about. So on the water changes, this is set up where the display tank will get a 25-gallon water change per day. I take that water, I trickle it over, I send that to the holding tank. That is the source for 5-gallon water changes on each of the QTs that happen each day. And nice cost savings doing it that way, but that's not actually the primary reason I set it up that way. It's so that I keep absolute parity of parameters between display and the QT tanks. And frankly, if I have any issues with depletion of key nutrients or trace elements in the display, I'm going to be a lot more concerned about it than trying to put fresh water in the QTs. So using a bunch of liter meter pumps for that, in part because I had a few on hand, in part because I had good experience with them. Some stuff on backboard. This is one of the 2 boards that will run those. So you see a master controller with 2 feeds. 15 of those that are doing the QT tanks and dosing, and then a larger pump called a stimmer, which is doing the 25 gallons per day. RODI and salt and mixing. What you're looking at here is the salt mixing station. So the big black tank is purified RODI water. The white tank on the right is the salt water, and the one in the middle is the cone bottom with a big white mouth on it. So it's a 12-inch mouth. It's down accessible, so I can just pour the bucket of salt. Easy enough. And then the 2 white things to the left of the black, if you're curious, are the 2-part dosing. So there's a 30-gallon reservoir for calcium. Vacuuming side, so if you look here, we're looking down the length of the canopy inside. And on the right hand is the gray piping. You can see 3 valves, one at the very front and 2 down the way. Those have quick release connectors for a hose with a wand on it, and that's under a continuous siphon down to the sump room, and I can choose to send it to filter socks or to send it to drain. But now vacuuming is just hop on this hose, get that part of the sand bed in that bay, move to the next bay, vacuum. So it's to keep it an absolute minimum of effort required to do that. Here we're looking at the sump and the filter socks. So these are 32-inch filter socks, 6 of them for the main flow, 3 for secondary flow. As you can see, all I have to do is reach out and lift them out. There's a washer in the room with them, so just throw them in, pop the other side in. No excuse for not doing it every 3 days, every 4 days as necessary. So the biological filtration, this is both a maintenance and starts to get into a little bit of system detail stuff, but sparse aquascape and no refugium, no deep sand beds, start to worry about having enough biological filtration capacity. So these ceramic blocks are about 8 by 8 by 4. They each have about 25,000 square feet of surface area for bacteria to colonize. There's a batch of them that go in the sump for high flow that deal with ammonia and nitrite breakdown, and then a set in a very low flow reactor for nitrate reduction. I don't know for certain that's going to work, but I'm going to start there. Certainly before I mess with anything in the solver tank. And then these blocks are also very easy to maintain. So rock accumulates crop and detritus over time. I can pop out 25% or so of these on a monthly basis, throw them in a bleach solution and acid, and then put them back in. And always have good, clean, open biological filtration substrates. Some other principles I put into the system. I'm a bit OCD, I like things neat. So all the wires are trimmed out. Try not to have any loose tubes or hosing anywhere. And then fully contained. With the 750, I had a little fish room and I had stuff under it. But I also had 2 cabinets in the butler pantry, 2 cabinets in the kitchen that I took over, 2 cabinets in the utility room that I took over, 2 shelves in the garage. I added a 7-foot standing storage shed thing in the backyard. I still had crap floating around on the patio. So I was really determined to try and get everything where there's one place where I can take the fish stuff or the coral stuff. And so there's a lot of emphasis on cabinetry. So time-wise, I guess I do have a little bit of time to go into system details. So filtration side, I've touched on a few of these. Again, I want to keep it as simple as possible. At the end of the day, it's really a skimmer and some filter stocks. And then the ceramic medium for biological supplementation. On the supplementation side, just 2-part dosing. Those regular water change schedules should help keep up. That 25 gallons a day works out to 1.25% per day, or 37% water volume change per month. So in terms of other trace elements, I'm hopeful that that'll help keep up. Fish quarantine, their filtration is really just a smaller, thinner version of the ceramic block that provides 8,000 square feet. Part of that is also so when I do the initial transfer of 4 75-gallon tanks worth of fish into the new tank, I can actually move their biological filter with them into the sump and not have to rely on it. I was a little worried about possibly getting a mini cycle when I dump 40 fish into this tank. But yes, I will cycle it, but I don't want to make fish in it. And then lighting side, lighting is done pure LED. There was only one choice for me that I could find for dealing with 56 inches of water depth plus the 32-inch air gap. These are 120-watt cannons from Exotic. So pairs of them, they're basically put on 2-foot intervals, but they're done in pairs, one blue, one white, and dimmable independently. Lower right-hand side, you're looking at the ballast and driver system and how I consolidate those down to just the 2 channels of drivers and 4 plugs. Those are the things. And then I was, even with that, a little concerned whether this was going to be enough. I have done a water test in the system, and I was able to get 75 to 140 par at the very bottom of the tank, and 350 to 440 on the upper rock. So I think I should be good to go for keeping all types of controls I want. I actually like having some lower output spots because I do want to have a few LEDs. On the flow side, the return aspect, I'm looking to exchange 2 to 4 times system volume per hour through the sump. So that's 4,000 to 8,000 gallons per hour. It's going to fluctuate during the day since the pump is programmable. This outputs to 2 C-scroll 1.5-inch rotating returns, keep surface chop and a little randomness to the flow. All of this is driven by one thing about being so incredibly slow about this build is that the pump I wanted finally was made. So I started with these Abyss pumps, which are absolutely magnificent pumps if you're looking to treat yourself for any remotely normal sized tank. But they can only do about 4,500 gallons per hour, and at the 29 feet of effective head that I have, they were going to be down to a trickle of like 1,500. So I was going to need 7 of them to drive the tank. But a company, Pentair, and for those of you familiar with Aquatic Eco, I guess one bought the other not too long ago. Pentair's been doing pool pumps forever. Many people consider them the best, and they modified one of those DC variable speed pumps to have saltwater seals. And came out last year, and I got it. I've done the initial test, and so far so good. On the closed loop side, this was probably a lesson learned on the tank. I went back and forth, closed loop or no closed loop. I'd always previously run with the no holes in the tank approach. Other than the overflow, everything up and over. I decided this was so big and I didn't want to have power heads everywhere in the tank, that I probably had to have some supplementation. I ended up with what may be the worst of both worlds. I did a closed loop, but I only put 2 bulkheads in there. So it's not enough to be complete by itself, but it introduces the risk of the holes. We'll see if I decide it was the right decision. And then the power heads, I kind of have Tunzi up against Hydro Wizard right now. So I wanted all the power heads limited to just on the overflow wall. So I have a vertical wall of 5 Tunzis. And then this loose pump at the bottom is the Hydro Wizard, which is supposed to flow about as much as 3.5 of the Tunzis. And basically on the 2 sides of the overflow, there the Tunzis are installed. Hydro Wizard will go on the back side, so they'll alternate firing to set up a gyro in opposite directions. Love Tunzi products, so it's just if I can get out of maintaining 6 power heads and do 2 instead. On the closed loop, so as I mentioned, just the 2 bulkheads. So if you squint here, at the far right edge by the overflow is the intake, and at the far left edge is the one and only output. And that's done. That output is now currently buried under some orangutane rocks. It's unnatural, but it's 4 outlets, including one which fires straight up to, again, I hope help with oxygen exchange, given a relatively deep tank. On the fish room, I went into it with a few design objectives. So I wanted sufficient storage for everything, like I mentioned before. Wanted a large sink and a lab desk area where I could do everything in there and not be going to another place for some of the tests and stuff. Moisture resistant, talked about that at some length. Easy to attach things to walls, so I put behind the drywall is 3/4 inch plywood backing everywhere around the room, which has been invaluable because I have stuff hanging everywhere and all I do is just pop a screw in the wall and I know that it's firm and stuff. All right, so just a few pictures of the storage galore. So there's an entire wall of cabinetry about 10 feet tall to 10 feet wide. So if you look on the right there, actually, so that middle has 3 500-pound rated full extension drawers, so I can put 5 fully loaded large salt buckets or other bulk supplements on there and be able to get access to the inside. And then over at the filtration portion, there's a narrow set of cabinetry. That blue desk-looking thing on the right is where all of the reactors are going to go for the filtration. And then the drawers are 30 inches deep and they can hold a good bit of kit. So that's a 2 horsepower pump in the back right scale. More on the fish room. This is just shots of the quarantine lab and storage areas before the 7.5s arrived. So I guess for bearings, there you're standing right in front of that wall of cabinets looking down. Filter room proper. So sump on the left, it's 10 feet long and 3 feet wide. So lessons learned, areas for improvement so far. Again, not running out 0 living fish in the system, so take it all with a grain of salt. But one thing is 48-inch width is way too narrow for the height. It's not just about visual proportions, but it's awkward to work with. Wasn't able to leave enough room to be able to walk in front of all the features of the aquascape. So maintenance over time is going to be that much more painful. Just an unfortunate architectural necessity. The sump, similar thing. Fish room is only 8 feet wide inside, so it had to be relatively tall. 44-inch height. It's going to be a pain to clean when it comes time to do that. I had drain bulkheads installed for every chamber on the sump, thinking when it's time to drunk, I'll just drain it all onto the floor, and then it's that much easier to vacuum out. Well, they're too big, they're a little too high. All that plumbing in front of the sump for routing the draining was going to be too painful. Really would delete those in hindsight. If I weren't already too tall, I might design a sump that was elevated and had actual bottom drains. That would probably be usable, but those side bulkheads. I did end up having to go with a pump that has seals for the return. That was just necessary for the scale that I needed, unless I wanted to get a large number of smaller pumps. There's only a single return pump, which I don't love. So if that goes out, I lose cycle in display and filtration. Downside, the skimmer pump is 4,500 gallons an hour to feed the skimmer, and I can reroute it to the display at some turnover as necessary. And there's a lot of flow in the tank, so oxygenation shouldn't be a problem. Don't have automated feeding. For those who follow Reef Central, there's a 900-gallon system. My guy named Elliot, he has this really cool fridge freezer unit, but he runs some pipes through it as an automated food dispenser, and you can actually leave the tank for a few weeks at a time. I might take a stab at something like that after everything else is stable. And then this skimmer, it's a great skimmer. I had a RK2 before, which was not as good in many ways, but it did have auto washdown for the cup and the outer portion of the neck as well. This one only washes down the inner port, which is what you need for true functionality. But again, if I want to keep things neat, not quite what I was after. And then there's a big difference, at least for me, between 1.5 inch plumbing and 2 inch plumbing. I've had all of my leak issues around 2 inch plumbing. Ended up supplementing with silicone because I couldn't get it working with just tape. And so that's my lesson. The secondary lesson is discovered some things didn't work quite the way I wanted after I had silicone. Now it gets messy. So make sure you're really done before you do silicone 2 inch fittings. And that's it. So my user ID on Central and R is DM Rogers. I've heard about the thread already. Any questions?
How did you calculate your 2% SPS here?
Completely made it up. So it feels like it has to be safe because I didn't feel like there was any degradation in the 205 until the softies got to probably close to 50%. So it's just really you can substitute for that absolute minimal, just a few select tokens.
And this is a percentage. How did you calculate what's 100%?
So the volume of coral life in I have, so if I have 12 SPS that are the size of a softball, then maybe I can have water and salt the size of a softball. Completely made up. Very happy to, or those of you with a little more scientific backing, happy to do so.
Construction costs, maybe I missed it, I apologize for the phone call again.
Yeah, it's high. I don't like to talk exact numbers, but it wasn't as high as on pure construction as you might have feared, in that it was using a lot of standard commercial techniques. So that elevated portion of the house was actually built a lot like a commercial parking enclosure. People pop up all the time. And similarly, the fish room is a lot like a commercial kitchen. So if I put it in terms of relative to standard construction, there was maybe a 50% premium.
I had a question about your quarantine choices. I noticed you put quarantine for fish.
Yeah.
But only one quarantine for all. I'm curious why.
Yeah, so we'll see if this works out. The plan is I'm going to introduce big batches of coral in that tank. And the risk, of course, is I could have a cascade of nastiness from one bad introduction, so I can risk losing entire batches. Hoping that I'm not going to pack it super dense the first few iterations. I'll watch them very, very closely at first. If I do have some unwanted pests, I'll relocate them to another tank. So I may repurpose one of the fish quarantines for coral rehab possibly, and I do have LED lighting on the fish QTs. So, but yeah, it's definitely a risk. It was more about space and complexity. No, I have nothing against them. The two that I'm using are actually on the RODI reservoir and on the saltwater reservoir, not on the system. And on the system, I didn't find that they really, I guess my philosophy on the system is have disease or a pest in the system, which is somewhat mitigated by UV, that's a bigger problem. UV is kind of a Band-Aid on top of it, and I'd rather just know and deal with it. There is some clarity that I ran 150 watt UV on the 750, and I did like the water clarities, especially the first ones. I won't say I won't go back to one, but for now I'm going to see if I can. Now, why UVs on those reservoirs? More speculation, but I had come across a thread and suspect I had the same issue myself at one point with the 750 where certain bacterial buildups happen in reservoirs and then have implications for the tank. And it might be that bacteria is, even though it's a freshwater reservoir until they mix the salt at the last minute, I don't know if it was bacteria that stayed toxic through the transition or maybe they died and released toxins as part of making it into salt water. But I had a period of time where I couldn't find anything wrong with my parameters. When I did a water change, it made things worse. I was doing lots and lots of water changes, and my reservoir had been running for 7 years at that point, so I fully bleached it, and then water changes started helping. I thought maybe something nasty was in the reservoir. And again, thinking 30 years out, if I could prevent biofilms and other stuff forming as aggressively in the reservoirs. That's why the newer reservoir was black. If I had been buying both reservoirs, they both would have been black, but I already had them.
I think you're right on about the lighting intensity. I fully agree on it. You're not trying to really blast the corals with light. I'm interested in the spectrum portion of it. The nanometer, the wavelength of the blue LEDs you're using.
I'm sorry, I don't. I want to say 450, but I went and looked at so many different lighting configurations that could be misinformation. I will say there is only one blue 120 watt exotic, so it always matches pretty easily.
Yeah, 450 and 470 seem to be standards. Some people are migrating to 420s, next to 405s. I'll talk about some of that in my talk.
Cool. Okay.
So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I do have supplemental cabling run in the canopy, so I can do spotlight either to address shadowing issues or possibly spectrum issues with a few additional spots over time.
What size frags are you thinking about putting in? Because I mean, my size frags and your size frags might be different. I know you want to start small, but what's your
No, I'm open to everything. So it's you know, everyone likes a larger frag, I think, but I'm not going to refuse to consider a 1-inch frag just because it's 1 inch today. Again, lots and lots of time. Anything else? Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. I am officially super grateful that we already bought our house and moved into it, and the fish room is done, and there will be nothing added to it. I'm pretty sure HOA prevents you from pulling IVs into the house, so don't get any ideas, but. So right now, we're actually about to head into our lunch break. We have the vendor hall open, and we'd really like to draw your attention to two of our premium sponsors that are here today. We've got the Austin Aquarium, which you all know and love, down south, been in business for as long as most people in Austin have been in the reef keeping game. And we also have River City Aquatics. Those are our two kind of local Austin ones. And then we'd also like to give a shout out to two of our other sponsors. We've got Nico's Reef, which is the latest addition to the Austin local fish store scene. And he's the one-stop shop for all things related to reef when you're in Northeast Austin. And we'd also like to welcome some out-of-towners, World Class Aquatics. They are specializing in saltwater aquariums, maintenance, moving, and consulting. World Class Aquatics is your San Antonio source for all things reef related. And before you go to lunch, if you are interested in any of the raffle items in the first drawing, which will take place at 12:25, go ahead and put your tickets in for that. Something that we would like to draw your attention to in the first set of raffle items are the Sir Media substrate that Paul is using in his sump. So we've got two sets of them. One will go in the first set of auction, I guess raffles, and the other will go in the second set. So if you want to give the new method of biofiltration a try, just like Paul is, those are available as raffle items. So we're going to take a break now. Go ahead and check out the vendor hall. Go ahead and chat with everybody, and feel free to interact with our speakers and ask Paul if you've got any more questions. Lunch ends at 12:25, and that's when the first raffle prize winners will be announced. Thank you guys so much.